Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar about the emotional disturbance qualification scales. And we have, as you just heard, so many good people on this call. So we're going to try to be expeditious and move through some of these early slides, which, as you see, announces mine and Cecil Reynolds' conflict of interest, but also provides an overview of the BASC-3. In order to make sure you get adequate content about the EDQs, we're going to move pretty quickly and presume that you have some knowledge of the BASC-3 system. If you do not, there are other webinars available on the Pearson website and other information that's pretty readily available on the BASC-3. So I have the pleasure of starting us off this morning. I'll be followed by Dr. Cecil Reynolds, and then Jessica Lascano will finish up, and both of them have some wonderful content that I want you to hear. So as a matter of quick review, we'll go through the federal definition of emotional disturbance, which, as you know, is long-lived, basically from the 1970s. So I think we can move through this pretty quickly. So we have these 5 areas: inability to learn, inability to build and maintain interpersonal relationships, inappropriate types of behavior and feelings under normal circumstances, general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. So these 5 areas are where Cecil led us in particular in creating the EDQs measures to give you a quantitative estimate of how a child compares to others in these 5 areas. So your familiarity with those will help you immensely as we move forward. So next slide, please. There you go. Thank you. So here's the BASC-3 model, and presuming quite a bit of knowledge of this, the essence of the BASC-3 model is comprehensiveness. In other words, the BASC is not a test. The BASC is in fact a system, and that's why that word was included in the title, so that you have measures of classroom observation, in the form of the SOS, which we'll discuss at the end. And you have the measures that are less well publicized, such as the structured developmental history. So you have observations, you have qualitative historical information, and then 3 quantitative measures, the teacher, parent, and child self-report. And wrapping this all together makes it possible to make a classification decision for special education in the category of emotional or behavioral disturbance with a much greater confidence because of the comprehensiveness of the BASC-3. Next slide, please. So these are indeed all diagnostic components. The structured developmental history, for example, may not look like a diagnostic component, but it is. Because it's the only measure we have on the BASC for determining age of onset, for example, and developmental course of a child's problems. So the SDH digitally available is an often, quite frankly, overlooked key to making a DSM diagnostic system or proper use of the EDQs in terms of determining special education eligibility. So please be aware of the importance of historical information, qualitative information, particularly regarding developmental course of a child's symptoms and age of onset. Just to give you an example, some of you, I'm sure, serve high schoolers, and you've seen referrals where a child basically is thought to have caught ADHD at age 14 or 15 or 18 years of age. And a severe case of it. That's not a typical age of onset for ADHD, right? To be in the gifted program up until somewhere in high school and then suddenly have inattention, hyperactivity, and academic problems associated with that. So that's just a brief example of the importance of every component of this system for giving you confidence in your special education placement decisions and DSM diagnostic decisions, including the parenting relationship questionnaire at the end, which gives you great insight into intervention and treatment options as you assess the relationship between offspring and parent. Next slide, please. Yes, the BASC-3 model, as I just mentioned, is intended to be comprehensive in nature in order to give you great confidence in making these sorts of decisions. I think we'll move beyond this slide because I've essentially preluded that slide already. All right, next, please. So there are many ways to talk about combined or same-sex, same-gender norms here. And what I'm going to do in order to shortcut this part of the presentation as well is to basically say, for virtually all purposes, the combined gender norms, combined sex norms make the most sense for your cases. So if you're using the BASC-3 already, parent-teacher rating scales, or the student self-report, this is the default setting. And the reason that it's the default setting is that it maintains differences between the gender groups, and there are known differences in, for example, hyperactivity behaviors, attention problems, anxiety, etc., between the gender groups. There's much work to be done here, and some of these changes could differ in the years to come, but there's a long history of those differences between groups. So the gender norms, the combined gender norms preserve these differences. If you do not think that there are differences between gender groups, then the same-sex norms, comparing boys to boys, girls to girls, is one way to go, because that equalizes the prevalence rates on the individual BASC scales across those two gender groups, which, as we know, is simplistic these days to speak of gender in a dichotomous way. So there will undoubtedly be some changes here, but for now, it makes the most sense to use the combined gender norms, and feel free to look at other resources to research this further. Next, please. So there is a difference between diagnosis and eligibility. And our overarching goal with the development of the EDQs is to identify eligibility for special education and related services, not to make a DSM diagnosis, not to make an ICD diagnosis, but to simply determine eligibility. Some of you work in situations where you have to use both, where you have to have full consideration of the DSM criteria and determine special education. Those are different processes. They have different types of utility. For example, most of the treatment research in the child psychopathology literature is centered on DSM diagnosis or DSM classification, not on emotional disturbance eligibility. So eligibility, using the 5 areas that the scales measure of the definition of emotional disturbance, is important in the school setting, certainly from a statutory standpoint. But if you wish to make a diagnostic decision, a la the DSM, or if you have to make a diagnostic decision using the DSM, then that's a different process. And in the BASC software, those of you who use that are well aware that DSM diagnostic considerations are given in the software as part of the output to help you make the decision, for example, not between eligibility for special education versus not, but between not having a disorder and having a disorder, and differential diagnosis between disorders, conduct disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD, etc. So our only request is that you consider the EDQs measures as measures of eligibility, not diagnosis for treatment planning purposes. Next slide, please. So now I have the pleasure of turning over the presentation to Dr. Reynolds, who will run us through the next series of slides, and I'll join us again a little bit later. Dr. Reynolds, please.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody, and thank you for being willing to share your time with us today. I know it's a very, very busy time of year, especially for school psychologists. So we very much appreciate you being willing to tune in today and listen to our explanation of the EDQs. As Randy was saying, eligibility is the key to obtaining services, but it tells us little about actual treatment and treatment planning. But we still have to assess and evaluate eligibility. So let's look now at how the BASC-3 helps with the eligibility decision, and we'll turn to the question of differential diagnosis and differentiated services just very briefly once we cover that issue. So if we look at the IDEIA definition and link it to the BASC-3 model, we know that we have good coverage with our system. And again, the BASC-3 is not a single test. And that comes up periodically. People ask me, can I use the BASC-3 to identify emotional disturbance? How can we do that? Because we're not allowed to use a single test for that. We have to use multiple instruments. Well, the BASC-3 is a lot of instruments. It's a whole family of instruments. So we can assess and look at whether or not the characteristics of an emotional disturbance have existed over a long period of time and to a marketed degree that adversely affect a child's educational performance. We have the history, the SDH. We have always recommended detailed clinical interviews and a review of records, and there's no substitute for that as part of this process, by the way. We need to know if there's impairment. That's the adverse effect. And the adaptive scales are particularly helpful in this, but specific behavioral scales also will line up with the criteria as we see momentarily. But the functional impairment index is also critical to consider in the end in determining eligibility, because we have to show adverse impact. No functional impairment, no eligibility, no diagnosis. And the adaptive scales can also often inform least restrictive placement decisions. Next, the EDQs are new content scales that provide a prima facie match to the 5 qualifying criteria of the federal definition of ED. We also provide you with a social maladjustment indicator. It's important to understand that these scales are expert derived and based on a content level match of the BASC-3 clinical, adaptive, and content scales to the federal criteria. These are not empirically or actuarially derived scales. They are expert derived. And I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes. Each scale is a rescaled composite score of other BASC-3 scales. So this is not done at the item level. It is a set of composite scales. Next. Separate gender and combined gender norms are also available for the EDQS, but not clinical norms. The BASC3 EDQS composites are simply numbered in correspondence to the federal definition criteria. So here you can see that correspondence. For example, EDQS 1 corresponds to the first criteria, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships. 2, inappropriate feelings under normal circumstances. 3, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. 4 is the somatization issue. 5 looks at schizophrenia and notes that the term doesn't apply to children who are only socially maladjusted unless they also have an emotional disturbance. Here are the scale compositions broken out by form. So we wanted you to know which scales are part of this. This information is also in the supplementary information guide for the EDQS that is available to all BASC3 users free of charge on the Pearson website. So you can see here that we've placed scales based on how well they match up to each of these 5 criteria. And some of these are reverse scored. For example, the leadership scale is scored in a positive direction on the BASC. When it's composited into the federal criteria for emotional disturbance, it is reverse scored because many of those items will reflect the criteria if they are absent in a child's life. The social skills the same way, interpersonal relations. So these are areas where ordinarily we're looking for positive features in children's behavior, and the absence of those positive features can contribute to identifying children as being a prima facie match to the federal criteria. So you can refer back to this table as you're looking for more detail in the future about how these scales are composited and precisely what contributes to them. I do occasionally get questions in social media and by email where folks will ask me for the list of items. And remember, as I said just a few moments ago, these are composite scores of scales. So if you want to know the items are actually there, but they will be at the back of the report under each of these scales. So take a look at them there. We don't list out the items separately because this is a composite. Okay. The BASC3 EDQS social maladjustment indicator is only offered for the TRS and PRS, not the SRP. And this is designed to identify cases that require more detailed investigation on your part. And remember that the term social maladjustment has not been operationally defined by the federal IDEA legislation. And that's quite problematic in many ways because its interpretation and use varies widely across the field. For example, some states and local districts will use disorders like conduct disorder and ODD to indicate exclusively the presence of social maladjustment. So some states and some local jurisdictions do not use those as rule outs for ED, but some do. So there's a lot of inconsistency in how social maladjustment is interpreted and applied across the United States. So the proper interpretation and use of the SM classification and its definition continue to be controversial because we have very, very little federal guidance and no operational definition. And we are not intending to supersede your local policies on this. Rather, the BASC-3 SM indicator gives you an aggregated normative database based on a prima facie match to the federal definition of emotional disturbance. And our content-derived indication of what would constitute social maladjustment as Randy and I view it on the BASC-3. So it's offered to you as a suggestion that further assessment procedures may be warranted depending on the guidelines set forth by your state or your local district. But don't forget that many students who are socially maladjusted are also emotionally disturbed, and being socially maladjusted does not rule out ED. There is a high comorbidity rate between social maladjustment and certain forms of emotional disturbance. The EDQS social maladjustment algorithm emphasizes detection of SM in the absence of other indications of ED. And it will be unusual for an examinee to have positive results on both, but it will happen. It is certainly not impossible, but we emphasize going the other way. This is the algorithm basically for a positive presentation of the social maladjustment indicator. And if you have a self-reported personality at the adolescent level, we also recommend that as follow-up, you take a look at the sensation-seeking scale. Because in cases of social maladjustment, it is often at a T-score of 60 or higher. But this emphasizes having a social maladjustment in the absence of other internalizing problems. But just remember, you can have both SM and ED. You can have substance abuse and ED. Having social maladjustment does not grant you immunity from being emotionally disturbed. The BASC-3 EDQS are only available by computer scoring. There's no hand scoring option. It's available to all the computer scoring options at no added cost, and it's automatically included with the other content scales unless you deselect it in the report menu options. So if you're not seeing it in your reports, it could be because it's been deselected by an administrator or someone else who has access to your accounts. Or it could be that you're using the clinical norm group. I've had several people email me and say, gosh, where are they? And it turns out they were using the clinical norm group. And we don't provide it for the clinical norm group for what I think are pretty obvious reasons, but happy to discuss that later. We also need to distinguish between the EDQS and the Emotional and Behavioral Disorder Index. The EBD index and the EDQS were created using radically different methods. And so they're complementary levels of information. They give you very different types of information. They will not always agree, but they will agree more often than not. Remember that the clinical indexes or actuarial indexes on the BASC-3 are derived purely actuarially with no regard for item content. The EBD index is based on the ability of items to differentiate purely at a statistical level students in special education with pre-existing classifications of ED from non-referred students. It reflects how closely the BASC-3 item scores match those of students who were being identified nationwide as ED at the time BASC-3 was standardized. Randy and I both perceive a national referral bias that favors teacher referrals of students who tend to be more aggressive and display more externalizing problems as opposed to internalizing. So the EBD index subsequently correlates more highly with externalizing disorders and is a little less sensitive to students with internalizing disorders. In sharp contrast, the composites that make up the EDQS are solely content derived, based on expert opinion and consensus to match the content of the BASC-3 scales to the criteria of the federal definition. Here is an example of the computer score report. And here we see an 8-year-old with results of the TRC, and this is an example of how those results would be displayed. And I can't see actually on this screen because I'm a presenter, the bottom bar is blocking the presentation of the SM indicator. But here you have an example of the display that you get from the TRS, and this particular child showed clinically significant findings in multiple areas, which is suggestive, highly suggestive to me that they would qualify for an ED placement. But there's more to the story with any individual child, as you'll see momentarily. Next. We also provide you with a narrative. This is how the narrative would look for this particular child. And I'm not going to read this to you. You'll see this in the reports and you'll have it in the handout that you can download. But it simply indicates the findings, the percentile ranks, puts it into a narrative. You can edit this, copy and paste it into your reports. Feel free to use this. But be sure to edit it to fit the individual case that you are reporting. In this particular case, the social maladjustment indicator was present, which, as I said, is a more unusual finding in the case of also the child corresponding to the federal criteria, particularly in areas that may be characterized as internalized. So we need to follow up in more detail and determine the cause of this child's behavior. Next. Here's another example of an SRP EDQS report for an adolescent at age 15. And once again, this is one who has pervasive issues that would qualify them on a prima facie basis for placement in an ED program. Next. Here's an example of the kind of narrative that you would get with the self-reported personality EDQS scales. So this young woman's scores are reflected here, as well as how we would match that up. So again, you get a good look at what the narrative is like. Feel free to use this, edit it to fit the specific case. Next. Here's another example, this one for a parent rating scale. And you can see here that this particular child has a great deal of difficulty with interpersonal relationships and with physical fears and symptoms, which are typically internalizing in nature. And on a prima facie basis would again qualify a child under the federal definition. Next. Here's a sample of the narrative that you would see with the parent rating scale. The narratives are similar across the teacher, parent, and child. So again, it establishes the score, the percentile rank, gives you a basic fundamental interpretation of it, but one that you do need to edit for your individual case. Next. So the BASC3 EDQS reflect new combinations of BASC-3 scales that have been grouped to align with the constructs of ED as represented in the most recent version of IDEIA. Now, these constructs serve as the minimum criteria that are used to determine eligibility for special education as ED under the federal rules. These should be useful to you and complementary to the EBD index, in particular in the context of a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. Remember, though, these are expert scales designed to match criteria. These scales do not answer the question of why students behave the way they do. So it's important to remember that some who meet the criteria for ED based on their behavior may actually be better categorized under a different disability when their behaviors are better accounted for by the other disability. Good examples of this, we think, are examinees who, for example, have ADHD or ASD. As you know, nearly all students with ADHD will have inappropriate behavior under normal circumstances. Sometimes this will be, in fact, caused by an emotional disturbance, and a student can be qualified under both criteria. Other health impaired is ADHD and ED because of their behavior. But in many cases, the behaviors are better accounted for by the presence of ADHD. So qualification as ED or multiple handicap would not be appropriate. As you know, examinees with ASD will almost always be unable to build and maintain appropriate relationships with peers and teachers. So when you look for the most appropriate school placement for an examinee with ASD whose ED indicators are elevated, remember that it's important for you as the clinician who's doing a comprehensive evaluation, who's taken a detailed history and done a clinical interview, to discern whether the qualifying behaviors are in addition to ASD or are simply caused directly by the ASD. That will get you to the right qualification. Also remember that students with ID have a higher prevalence rate of mental health disorders than those with normal intellectual development. However, some are simply exhibiting immature behaviors consistent with their developmental level, and this may give them the superficial appearance of being emotionally disturbed. So be sure to investigate the source of ED symptoms with all referrals, but particularly in cases of ID, because they may be an indication of comorbid ED or may better be accounted for by their developmental level. And that may seem a daunting task, but it is very much one that we are all asked to do I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I got kicked out there for a second, but I'm assuming I'm back in. But it's a common task that we are all asked to do in the context of differential diagnosis. Next. So the BASC-3 EDQs qualification scales supplemental guide, as I mentioned, is on the Pearson website. It's available to you for free access. Please read it before using these scales. Next. Qualification, remember, means access, but differential diagnosis is crucial to treatment success. Remember that treatment of child and adolescent emotional behavioral disorders should never be one size fits all. And the evidence-based literature for treatment requires specific diagnoses. And students with emotional and behavioral disorders deserve treatment, not just management. A declaration of eligibility, remember, provides access to services, but just a statement of eligibility is insufficient to determine the precise treatment. Next. One size fits all does not work. We do not want to become McDonald's. We need differentiated treatment. We have to match treatment to diagnosis. Once we know the more specific diagnosis, is it depression? Is it anxiety? What is it? Then we can design evidence-based interventions. Next. The BASC-3 model gives us the guidance and the materials, the wherewithal to make accurate differential diagnosis, not just classification. And we do link all of the BASC-3 profiles to evidence-based interventions and monitoring. The BASC-3 Behavior Intervention Guide is a tremendous resource and is available for computerized pull-ins into your interpretive report if you subscribe to the intervention report. Next. So be sure you're not interpreting test data blindly either. You might interpret this response very differently if you knew it came from a flying insect. Next. And sorry, but bugs and Rorschachs just seem to fit together. I couldn't resist throwing that one in. So history and context are crucial. Know who you are assessing and understand the context of their life. A careful history and detailed clinical interview are going to be your most powerful weapons in differential diagnosis. Next. Context absolutely is always important. Understand the context of a child's life. To you, that may look like lunch. To a chicken, it's a horror movie. Next. So always know who you're evaluating. Do not diagnose raccoons with insomnia because they stay up all night. Next. Here, for example, are 14 symptoms that are common to 3 disorders noted in the DSM. How in the world can you tell the difference between these three, among these 3 disorders? Next. These 3 disorders are ADHD, overanxious disorder of childhood, and PTSD. They all have these symptoms in common, but they all have different histories. And the context of symptom presentation will be different. Next. Direct observation also has a role to play. And I'm going to kick it back to Dr. Kamphaus now, who has some wisdom for us on observing children with the SOS.
Thank you, Cecil. Hello again. I had the good fortune of working with one of my doctoral students to develop the student observation system. And our goal with the creation of the SOS was to effect a compromise between comprehensive assessment of classroom behaviors without creating some of the difficulties involved in some of the timing that we need to get reliability. So we're trying to get reliability in a less onerous way and yet be comprehensive. So the SOS is designed as an observational system available like every other BASC component through Pearson to cover the categories that you see in front of you. And just like the rest of the BASC, one of the presumptions going into the development of the SOS was to assess both strengths, positive behaviors, in addition to problematic ones. So for example, it's equally important to identify appropriate response to the teacher or lesson as it is to assess inattention. We had just a very fascinating case some years ago where we had a little guy who was having significant inattention problems at home. We took a classroom observation of him and found that he was quite inattentive at school, but he was getting really good grades because he responded to the teacher appropriately, and his teacher was just unusually skilled at keeping him on task. And it really showed the strength of assessing both positive behaviors and problematic ones. As you see, during the observation period, we ask you to observe for approximately 65 behaviors that contribute to these overarching categories. Let's look at the next slide, please. Back to the, thank you so much, Aaron. So digital administration is really the only way to go because the observations are taken at 15-second intervals. And it's just, 30-second intervals, and it's just most important to have the timing available to you. It's incredibly convenient in digital format versus pencil and paper format. So it stores the student observation results in the same place as the rest of the BASC-3. And I also want to make you aware that the entire SOS is based upon a 15-minute momentary time sampling procedure. And that might seem brief, but we checked this out. So my doctoral student at the time, Nancy Lett, did a study where we compared the 15-minute observation to a lengthier 30-minute observation with the BASC SOS, and we got the same results. So I think it's because of the structure that encourages reliability of assessment that 15 minutes gives a very good sampling of typical classroom behavior for a child. Next slide, please. Great. And these are the scales that I previewed for you earlier. We have 4 positive scales, and then we have the problem scales, including inappropriate movement, inattention, inappropriate vocalization, somatization, repetitive motor movements, aggression, self-injurious behavior, inappropriate sexual behavior, and bowel bladder problems. As you can imagine from looking at this list, most of the behaviors that you're going to observe in the classroom for a typical teacher referral are going to fall into the top 3 categories: inappropriate movement, inattention, inappropriate vocalization. The other ones are rarely observed. Aggression, for example, is just not a high frequency minute by minute behavior, whereas inattention is. Same thing with self-injurious behavior, inappropriate sexual behavior. I've only seen bowel bladder problems captured by the SOS on one occasion. Next slide, please. So with that brief introduction to the SOS, I now get the pleasure of turning over the presentation to Jessica Lascano. Jessica, please.
Hello, thank you all so much for having me, and thank you everyone who's participating in the webinar. I greatly appreciate your time, and I'm thankful to be here and share information with you. So we're going to talk today about a case study, and this case study is about a boy named John, and I'm going to share with you how you can use the BASC EDQs as well as the other BASC systems to get a comprehensive picture of John. So let's get some background on John going. And I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes so we have time for question and answers as well. So John is a 17-year-old boy. He's qualified for special education since 2006. Initially, when he qualified, it was due to a developmental delay and an articulation problem. In 2009, he was identified with a specific learning disability and then an other health impairment due to ADHD in 2015. John was assessed for an emotional disturbance in 2015. He was found not to qualify. The examiner at that time said that social maladjustment was the issue. Currently, John's a community school student, and he is a community school student because he was expelled from his home school. John has a well-documented history of behavioral, social, and emotional problems, which began in his early elementary school years. These issues intensified when he began high school. Currently, he's got over 55 disciplinary infractions since leaving his comprehensive high school campus in 2017. These are including suspensions and problems in the classroom. He's had a lot of improvement since moving to his new setting, but we had some difficulties. And I'll get to that in the next slide. So John's moved school several times, IEP changes, discipline problems, transportation issues. His mother experienced domestic violence while he was an infant. And this continued through his early elementary school years. He witnessed all of that. And I'm going to reference that again at the end of what I have to present. John's diagnosed with depression and uses depression medication. His mother has a chronic illness, which causes hospitalizations and can lead to death. And I'm going to reference that again in a minute. John has a twin brother, and his twin brother has the same challenges. They're the same class. He does best with teachers who are kind, calm, patient, and proactive. He struggles with adults that could be school staff or teachers who are irritable, those that are coercive and reactive. He recently had a manifestation determination, and that's what brought me onto this case. That manifestation determination was based on a fight in which there was severe injury to a peer. We considered expulsion, but after we had a robust conversation with the team, we determined that the data from the previous assessment really may have indicated the presence of an emotional disturbance, and that particular assessment may not have been as comprehensive as it needed to be. So rather than move forward with the manifestation with the expulsion, we decided to do an ED assessment. Next slide. So in this particular assessment, the procedures I used were record review, interview with the parent, student, and teacher, and those interviews were very robust. The BASC structured developmental history, observation in classroom and testing setting. Unfortunately, at this time, I didn't have the BASC SOS. Academic testing and processing tests. And you'll notice there's no intellectual or cognitive tests, and that's because in California, we have a court case law, Larry P. versus Reynolds, which prohibits IQ testing for African-American students. I used also the BASC-3, parent rating scales, teacher rating scales, self-report, and then follow-up interview on each of those. This is just a reminder of the law, and Dr. Reynolds already broached this earlier in the presentation. And then this is just an example of what those EDQs look like. If you were going to run your report, this is what it would look like in the report. So I just cut and paste these from this student's report. You can just take a look at those, and I'll reference those in a minute. Next one, and next slide. Okay, so first, what I'm going to do is show you how I broke down the different areas that fall under ED, and then how I supported either meeting the criterion or not meeting the criterion using the information from the BASC, using observation, using interview, and then also using those EDQs. So this first one here is an inability to learn, which cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So essentially, we're looking for some sort of an emotional issue that is causing this inability to learn. But John has a well-documented history of specific learning disability. We know that he's had continued problems with reading, writing, and math. We know that he needs a lot of support in those areas. He's had problems throughout his elementary school years and high school years. And so really for this one, what I said is that, you know, these problems really are related to a well-documented learning disability. His frustration with tasks sometimes impede his ability to complete challenging work. But even before he had those problems, he was really struggling with academic tasks overall. Another note on this is that the way these are written, I used information from the previous webinar that Dr. Kamphaus and Dr. Reynolds did, which broke down the BASC and how to use the different scales and composites and how they correlate to these areas. So when you see these BASC scales and composites referenced, know that this came from their presentation from the past, and I applied it to my work. And so you can really count on these particular areas as supporting the different criteria. Next slide. This is where it starts to get really important to analyze what we have. So this is an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. And we're really looking for problems with that with this student. And for this student, his BASC self-ratings were fine. And that's something I wanted to share with you. Sometimes students who are living in sort of this chaotic state or having extreme emotional difficulties, they won't see how pervasive or intense their problems are, and they might rate themselves as average. That doesn't mean that you can't move forward with an ED sort of assessment or ED, say they meet the ED criteria. What you need to do is support your conclusions with information from the teacher and from the parents, as well as those in-person observations and that long history. So even if the student is not noting that they have issues, you can explain that by looking at what the student is actually doing, examining the behavior, and really considering those parent and teacher interviews and information that they provide, as well as your observations. And so in this particular, in this particular area, I just want to note that if you look toward the bottom, I talk about how the emotional disturbance qualification scales also supported eligibility, but I explain that John's don't. Again, you're going to look to the body of the explanation and really think about those observations, interviews, and other BASC ratings from the other two raters to support eligibility in this particular area. And you can read through that later. It's a great example of how to do it. The next area here, area C, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. This is an area that I think a lot of people get wrong. I think people tend to misperceive sometimes aggressive behavior as being purely socially maladjusted. But if you look at the literature in this area, what you'll see is that if a child's behavior is very pervasive or intense or very different than what you would expect for that child, you could say that it's inappropriate. You just have to analyze it. So for example, in this case, John would get very angry. And when he would get angry, he would have a hard time accepting no or redirection. He would argue, bargain, use physical force. And that on the surface might sound like social maladjustment, but when you look at the pervasiveness and the intensity of those behaviors, it was very obvious that he had lost all emotional regulation and control at the times of these events. So it would take him a very long time to calm down, to self-soothe. I'm talking hours, and he would need help from adults to really work through setbacks. And that's where we really start to think, you know what, this is something different than social maladjustment. It's not simply him breaking the rules or not wanting to follow directions or having opposition. It's deeper than that. He's got a ton of emotional difficulties that just spill out, and they look like anger, frustration, physical aggression. And I explain that here. And then you'll see again how I reference the emotional disturbance qualification scales, and I explain how those support eligibility in this area. Next slide. This is a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. Again, this is another area I think a lot of people don't understand the nuances of depression, especially in boys. And if you get a chance, I highly recommend you read up on that. But irritability and anger are two hallmarks of this unhappiness or depression. And this child had those sorts of issues. And a lot of people just chalked it up to him being oppositionally defiant. But really, when you looked deeper than that, you saw it was just like a chronic irritability, and he's having those issues at home, and he's having those issues at school. And, you know, he has a diagnosis of depression. He uses medication. He also has ADHD, which, you know, when you start looking at his history, probably is not ADHD, but probably is more a trauma-based response to what he experienced in his early childhood development. And so, you know, I explain here how this irritability and fluctuating mood really affect his educational performance. It's pervasive, it's intense. I get the BASC information from parent and teacher. I explain John's ratings, and then explain how, even though John says he doesn't have difficulty, there's many different examples of difficulty that he's exhibiting. And then I also add in the EDQs to support the conclusions I came to in this area, and you can read that on your own. Next slide. This next one is the tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. He would miss a lot of school. He'd be frantic at school. He'd get upset and want to use the phone. Well, it turns out that he was very nervous about the situation going on with his mother. She had a chronic health condition, and that led him to be just, you know, very anxious. And so I explain that here, and then I talk about how he was rated by parent and teacher, how he rated himself. And then I also, again, include the emotional disturbance qualification scales to support those conclusions. And next slide. And then this next one here is schizophrenia. So I just explain here, you know, what schizophrenia is, what it isn't. This student does have some of the features that could be it. There is a familial history, but when I look at just overall the totality of what's going on with him, I think we can better explain this area by the inappropriate behaviors or unusual behaviors in normal circumstances. And so I explain that here. I talk about the EDQs and I support my conclusions. In the next slide, we'll just touch on social maladjustment. Parent and teacher both did not have social maladjustment elevated ratings. And student, like I said, he rated himself mostly average, so he also didn't have indicators for social maladjustment. Previous assessment said that social maladjustment was his issue. Next slide. And so what I found with this case, he did qualify. Don't use one test. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Kamphaus both talked about that, but we're not using one test. You know, the BASC is very comprehensive, plus we're using observation, interview, other information. We're supporting our conclusions. You need to analyze and synthesize the data that you gather. So it's not enough to just copy paste and move on. You've got to really make it a story and support your conclusions with examples. You need to consider the marked degree, pervasive and intense, that long period of time, which varies depending on who you ask, but really support long period of time. The impact on educational performance needs to be described. Social maladjustment will never negate emotional disturbance. Trauma will not negate emotional disturbance. Trauma can look like ADHD, and make sure you only share information that's needed to support eligibility. I did not include the domestic violence information, nor did I include that mom had a chronic illness, because I really didn't need that to support eligibility. And then next slide, these are some resources for you all. I think that you'll find helpful. Great book, great resources that you can look at to help you with social maladjustment and ED. And then I also included my Instagram there, Practical School Psychology. If you send me a message there, I'm happy to send you sample reports and help you out. And I hope that this was helpful.
All right, so we'll turn it over to questions. Chris, are there any questions that you'd like to have our panel help with today?
There was one that came up and was asking about overrepresentation of certain student groups in being qualified for ED and how the BASC-3 could help reduce that disproportionality.
Well, I think Randy and I both have perspectives on that. I'll just chime in and he can follow up and as well. That, as I read the literature, is primarily a referral bias, that minority youth are simply more likely to be referred by teachers. And that if we find ways to subvert the referral bias, then we see these differences greatly minimized. And the best way to do that is to use objective screening measures. And our experience with the BASC-3 BEST, the behavioral and emotional screening system, is that it goes a long way to reducing those disparities because as I said, the research literature would indicate that teachers are simply more likely to refer children who are in minority groups within their districts. And so that leads to disproportionate identification of minorities.
Just to follow up on Cecil's comment, I agree. So the disproportionality starts in the referral process, and that's the primary cause of it. And so there are many interventions out there that folks are trying to change referral the referral bias, and it's hard because it's human judgment, and human judgment is either unreliable or of unknown reliability. That's one of the reasons we created the behavioral and emotional screening system, was to try to interject some reliability into the referral process for social, emotional, behavioral problems. Dr. Katie Eklund did a really nice study in California many years ago, I guess a decade ago now, where she had teachers nominate kids in their classroom for behavioral emotional problems that were of a magnitude that the teacher thought they needed to be attended to. And then the same teachers filled out our BEST screener, and we compared the results. And as you know, most of disproportionality is associated with boys and boys of color. And what Dr. Eklund found in this study was that the same teachers, when they completed the form that interjected some reliability, referred fewer boys. So using teacher opinion, there were more boys referred, significantly more boys referred than completing a screener. Something about these questionnaires helps raters, parents, teachers, kids, me, everybody kind of structure their thinking. But we can't do that at the referral stage. Because the BASC components have evidence of reliability and validity, they can maybe help keep kids from being over-identified and over-diagnosed and overly placed in special education programs, but really reliability at the beginning of the process is the ideal, as Cecil said.
And just to add one other piece of information to that, this is not something that is just in special education. You see it in all aspects of society where people are asked to make subjective judgments, which is what a referral is when it's based on teacher referral. It's a subjective judgment. And there is a great deal of research in all areas of psychology looking at this issue. And one principle keeps coming through over and over in every area, and that is, as the reliability of the process goes down, the probability of bias goes up. So subjective judgment feeds bias. And the more we can make it objective and the more we can enhance the reliability of the referral process, the more we minimize any biases that occur.
Great. Can we sneak in one more quick question? I know we're at the top of the hour.
Okay, here, is it possible for you to expand on the schizophrenia portion of the EDQS? Are there any statistical concerns of this measure that should be considered when interpreting results?
Well, I think the interpretation that the things that should be considered are more clinical in nature, and in examining the history. And as you know, we always recommend that people do examine the item level scores when scales like atypicality, which are heavily weighted in the schizophrenia component of the EDQS, are elevated. So the EDQS themselves, from a purely psychometric standpoint, are very highly reliable. Those composite reliabilities are consistently in the 90s. So from a psychometric standpoint, no. From a clinical standpoint, absolutely, as with any of these scales. And I think Jessica was just completely on point in talking about the need to do a more in-depth dive into these behaviors. And the history and the clinical interview and the context and the scores on other scales are all critical to that.
All right, just one quick note that I just put in the chat. Someone asked for us to put the resources from the handout in there. So if you would like to access them. Also, there have been some questions about the previous webinars, the one that Jessica mentioned, and those are available in a link that I put in the chat for all of the BASC3 webinars. Also, this webinar, probably by the beginning of next week, will be available as a recording.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, Dr. Kamphaus, and Jessica. Thank you all for being here today and sharing all this information. And thank you to all the participants in this webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to get together with us and to learn. We hope that this was helpful, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have further questions. Thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.